some would argue that it is the Israelis who are dragging the Americans into a war or embarrassing the Americans. I find this an absurd argument. The U.S. has supported such policies, has called for such policies, has pushed Israel to be more aggressive in the region since 1967. This is hardly new. I have a tendency to sort of come close. You should probably alert me when I come too close.
If it gets really out of hand, I'll let you know. We're good to go? Okay, we're starting in 3, 2, 1. Good day and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. Today with me is Joseph Massad. Joseph Massad is a professor at Columbia University. He specializes in modern Arab politics, intellectual history. He's a fierce critic of Israel and Western imperialism. Professor Joseph Massad, good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Professor, by the time this episode goes out, it will have been a year since October 7th. Israel is still bombing and occupying Gaza. It's now bombing Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and is on the brink of war with Iran. On October 8th, would you have predicted this?
Perhaps I would have, given the fact that Israel has been bombing Lebanon since the 1950s. It's been bombing Syria since more recently, since 2011, nonstop. It's been bombing Gaza since 2006. So yes, I would have expected Israel to continue to bomb these countries. It's been bombing and committing terrorist acts in Iran since 2010, when it assassinated nuclear scientists, when in 2011 it blew up a Revolutionary Guard missile base and killed scores of Iranians. So I don't think any of that is new. Perhaps the bombing of Yemen may be new, but also the Israelis have been involved in supporting the royalist forces against the Republicans back in the 1960s, alongside Saudi Arabia and Iran at the time. So yes, I would have expected that Israel would continue to attack all these Arab countries, as well as Gaza and the West Bank, as it has done for decades for now. Now, perhaps the scale of what has been unfolding in the last year, at least in terms of the kinds of aggression that Israel has launched against the Palestinians in Gaza, the pogroms in the West Bank, and the recent bombings of Lebanon, are of a different order than we've been used to, but certainly not Israel's aggression in itself.
Immediately after October 7th, what were your expectations, given everything you've said in the history of how Israel behaves? What were your expectations of how they would react? And what was your expectations of how the international reaction to that reaction would be?
Well, I mean, I certainly did not expect a genocide. I did expect more bombings of Gaza, as had happened again since 2006 and through, the next almost 2 decades. Israel has been bombing civilians in Gaza and killing scores of them. From, in 2006, it killed 400, and then slowly it began to kill thousands every time it has a bombing campaign, as it did in 2008 and 2009. 2012, 14, etc. So in that sense, I expected something similar, perhaps even with higher casualties. I didn't expect a genocide, although I must say I am not shocked by it. Israel is a country that has in many ways not abided by international law or any kinds of regulations for war. The Zionists, ever since their formal conquest of Palestine began on the last day of November in 1947, up to today, have not abided by such regulations and have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity at will, and which they, of course, always defend as their right to defend themselves, their right to establish a settler colony. And of course, I expected the United States and the European countries to fully support them, as they always have, and to refuse to apologize for their atrocities. Sometimes they apologize, some countries do, but always preface that by ensuring that they support or that they are heard saying that they support Israel's so-called right to defend itself against the captive population, and things of that sort. So yes, I mean, I was shocked by the scale of the ongoing genocide, though, again, I am not surprised, given the history of this rogue state that has indeed not stopped committing such atrocities and massacres ever since it was established, and even a few months before it was established.
How did we get here? How was this allowed to happen? And what do you think were the events that have occurred in the last year that have led us to the situation where we're basically potentially on the verge of regional war, and well over 40,000 people have been killed. By some estimates, close to 200,000 have been killed. And when you take all the other ways that people could die, not just bombing. How did we get here?
Well, I mean, it seems to me the fact that the Israeli settler colony, a Jewish supremacist state, has continued to consolidate its racism with legislating new laws that cement Jewish supremacy in the country. In 2018, it issued the nation-state law, which, of course, is yet another racist law that insists that only Jews have a right, an exclusive right to self-determination in Israel. Its apartheid policies have continued in the West Bank as well as inside Israel, and it continued to incarcerate millions of Palestinians in a concentration camp called Gaza, which it continued to bomb at will. Settler pogromists continued to roam sort of free across the West Bank as well as in East Jerusalem. All of this is in the background to what transpired on October 7th of the Palestinian resistance operation of that day. So what we do see is a huge amount of policies that have not abated in Israel. Aggression against Lebanon, of course, had continued. The ongoing occupation of Syrian land as well as Lebanese land is also ongoing, as is, in fact, the annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights, which, of course, was carried out upwards of 4.5 decades ago, but whose colonization also continues today. So we're speaking about a country that has been a major destabilizing force, an aggressor nation that has attacked all of its neighbors over the decades and continues to do so, continues to threaten them, as well as a country that has incarcerated millions of Palestinians and to whom it subjects to a Jewish supremacist apartheid and often terrorist sort of practices, especially in the West Bank, but also inside Israel and, of course, in Gaza. So we've gotten to this situation as a result of these Israeli aggressive policies over these decades, which refuse to abate. On the contrary, the increasing situation in Israel in terms of who gets elected, what kind of administration runs sort of the Israeli state, the kind of regime that continues to rule, tells us that these types of policies are increasing or will increase in intensity, will not decrease, as indeed they had in the last 20 years or so. So this is what got us to where we are today.
It's been a year. Did you think it would ever be ongoing for a year? I mean, and it looks like it probably would be going on for another year. And why do you think it's been allowed to just go on for a year?
Well, it has been, of course, amazing to see this continue as it has, that the genocide continue as it has, with the support and cover that the United States and Western Europe have given it. Of course, the Palestinian will to resist against the continuation of being incarcerated in a concentration camp and being killed at will by the Israelis has made it impossible for the Israelis to stop their genocidal campaign. For them, the Israelis have always said, the reason why we kill Palestinians is because they resist us. If the Palestinians stop resisting us, we will stop killing them. So the idea is, if the Palestinians accept the fact that we continue to steal their lands and subject them to apartheid and to Jewish supremacy, if they accept that they must exist in a concentration camp that we besiege from all sides and do not resist us, then we won't kill them. We just will continue to treat them the way we have. However, if they resist us, this causes us to kill more of them. So the idea is, for Israel and its supporters, those who claim in the West that Israel has a right to defend itself, what they're saying is, is that all the people that Israel subjects to this oppression do not have the right to resist it. And if they resist it, then Israel has the right to kill more of them, to oppress them even more. So therefore, the responsibility for the continuation of this genocide and the violence, according to Israel and its apologists and its US master, actually lies with the Palestinians who refuse to stop resisting this predatory state on their land and in their midst. In this sense, yes, I expected that as long as Israel continued to commit these atrocities, that the United States and the Western European countries would, of course, continue to give it all the support that they can, and then some. And of course, they have not disappointed. So in this sense, I would be surprised if someone were surprised that the United States, which of course in many ways gives orders to Israel in terms of foreign policy and its aggression. While, I mean, Israel is an extension of the United States in many ways. The Israelis do have freedom to run their own settler colony however they like. They have the freedom to oppress Palestinians in whatever way they like. But when it comes to aggressing against their neighbors, to their foreign policy, their military policy outside of Israel, they are very much beholden to American orders. And nothing that they do or can do, they are able to do without US approval. So this is what we are seeing, that indeed the US approves, the US supports militarily, directly through sending its own troops, its own military, its own naval sort of fleet to be there to help Israel, which it has helped and continues to help, providing it with intelligence, with ammunition, with money, as do its European allies. And therefore, it's not that the US is complicit in this genocide. The US itself is responsible for this genocide, as are its European allies, as is Israel. Israel would not be able to commit this without US help. No one contests this, of course. Some would argue that it is the Israelis who are dragging the Americans into a war or embarrassing the Americans. I find this an absurd argument. The US has supported such policies, has called for such policies, has pushed Israel to be more aggressive in the region since 1967. This is hardly new. This does not mean that the Israelis are not aggressive on their own, or that the Israelis are being pushed into wars not of their own making, or wars that they themselves do not want to enter. They do, but they do so specifically and most of the time on the orders of the US, their major master, of which they are an extension and an imperial station.
Most analysis sees it not exactly like that. They see Netanyahu going out of control, the US kind of, reluctantly allow him to go ahead, and he's really just on a path of destruction. And the other counter argument to what you've just said is the US were looking to get out of the Middle East. They have other things to think about. They have Russia, they have China, they extended in Ukraine already. So what's your response to that?
No, I mean, the US wants to destroy all possible rivals, all possible forces that defy its imperialist will around the world. There are three areas in the world where such forces exist. China is one of them. This is why the US has continued to mobilize and politicize the Taiwan issue in the last few years in the hope that it could have either a small scale or a larger scale war with China. Clearly, the US does not want an all-out war with China, but it uses Taiwan to threaten it and make sure it abides by whatever regulations the US believes it should. Russia is the same thing. It has set up Ukraine as a possible NATO base to attack and threaten Russia as a defiant member of the United Nations, and to keep it sort of also sort of on hold, making sure it understands the US is watching it and won't allow it to do things of which the US does not approve. In the case of the Middle East, Israel is that sort of a proxy for the US, and has always been. And in the Middle East, there are anti-imperialist and anti-settler colonial forces, mostly, of course, the Palestinian resistance, the Lebanese resistance, and a couple of regimes that refuse to abide by the US diktat. These include the Syrian government and the Iranians, as well as resistance movements in Yemen and in Iraq, who are refusing to be subjugated by US imperial will, and therefore are defiant of it. The US strategy is to weaken all these forces around the world, and therefore we see a major war in Ukraine. We see a threat of a major war between Taiwan and China, where US Navy ships have been shuttling between trying to have a show of force against China around Taiwan's shores, and then moving to the Middle East to defend a weak Israel against the resistance, which it has done sort of over the last year, back and forth between these two points of friction that the US itself is instigating. We also see how client regimes of the US have been trying to mobilize more aggression against China. We've heard a lot of declarations by the Philippine government, a vassal government really of the United States, that keeps speaking of how China is destabilizing the region, when in fact, of course, it is Taiwan and the US who are destabilizing that region, as they have done in the Middle East. So no, the US is not reluctant at all to entering into war. It would like to actually weaken all people who defy its will in the Middle East. Israel is its main instrument. I think the US has been disappointed that Israel is not as strong as Israel claims to be, or as the US has thought it was. This was amply made clear after the Palestinian resistance operation of October 7th, 2023. It was made clear again by the response of the Lebanese resistance to Israeli aggression, and by the recent retaliation by Iran against ongoing Israeli attacks against Iran and Iranian interests. In that sense, the US realizes that it needs to be there to help make sure Israel, its main proxy in the region, is not defeated. But at the same time, I don't think it would want an all-out war. The Iranians have threatened the US by explaining that if any of their petroleum installations were hit by Israel or by the US, that they would make sure to explode all the oil wells in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. That is something, of course, the Arab regimes of the Gulf, or allies of the US, would not like to see. While they want a weakened Iran, they're not really interested in this kind of a regional conflagration that could destroy their economies. The US also is not interested in this. However, the Israelis may overstretch their charge and their mission by trying to push the US into being convinced that an all-out war with Iran is in its interest, but they would not dare launch anything of the sort if the US did not permit it first. And I don't think the US at the moment is interested in this.
Just to be clear, so you're saying it's the US pulling the strings, it's the US saying, let's test Iran out, and it's not Israel being a belligerent child, so to speak, in client states. That's
Israel is a belligerent child, but I'm saying Israel is unable to do what it does without orders from the US and without permission from the US. So yes, I do think the US has a global strategy. Israel is part of that strategy. Israel agrees with that strategy because it is there to execute such a strategy. It was placed there by the British initially and by the European powers precisely to be a proxy for their colonial policies in the 1950s and 60s. We saw that when the British and the French insisted on Israeli help in launching a war against Egypt in 1956 so that they can go in and invade Egypt to prevent the nationalization of the Suez Canal. That was a very important role for Israel in 56. The Israelis were also instrumental, as I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, in helping the royalist forces in Yemen, along with other pro-imperial forces, fight against the Republican forces in the 1960s. So Israel had an important role to play for the British and for the French in the 50s and 60s, and for the Americans after 1967 as a proxy for imperial and neocolonial policies. So yes, does it have its own opinions, its own, exaggerated aggressions that the US may not want to go as far as Israel wants? I'm sure it does. Can it get away with doing all these things without American approval or permission, or even the Americans making the decision first? I think that is not necessarily possible, even if on occasions Israel may sort of exaggerate the charge it was given by the US. It is sort of held back soon after by the US to within what US strategists have defined for it.
Do you think we'll see a regional war? And if we did, what would be its consequences?
It is unclear. I mean, some analysts insist that the U.S. would not want a regional war during the elections, and if a regional war is going to unfold, this might happen after the elections. I'm not fully convinced. I mean, I'm sure the Democratic Party regime in the United States, if it felt that a war would help its chances of winning the elections this coming November, would have no hesitation in launching a regional war. If it felt that such a war might weaken its chances of election, then it won't. So it all depends also on the level of threat. Can the regional allies of the U.S. in the Arab Gulf be able to withstand such a regional war with an Iranian attack on their economies if they participate in a U.S. And Israeli attack on Iran? And they likely would, as they had done against Iraq back in 1991. So all of these are important considerations. Is it likely that a regional war will take place? I doubt that. Is it possible? Yes.
Do you think when Trump, if he potentially gets into the White House, do you think then suddenly the chances go up quite a lot, or not really?
Not necessarily. The Republicans, of course, have historically been a lot less belligerent and imperialist in terms of wars than the Democrats. As we know, aside from the Civil War in the United States, all wars of aggression and imperial wars that the U.S. has launched against the world have been launched by Democratic administrations until Reagan took power in the early 1980s. This is something actually that mainstream Republicans, Bob Dole, attacked the Democratic Party in a campaign in the 1970s, in the late 70s, saying that indeed the Democratic Party was a party of war because it had launched all the wars that the U.S. had been involved in. Now, since the 1980s, of course, the Republicans have tried to match that record after Reagan, but certainly, I don't think Trump would be more aggressive than the Democratic Party. I mean, in fact, he says that had he been in power, that all the wars that have unfolded as a result of American instigation, whether in Ukraine or in the Middle East, would not have taken place had he been in power. Now, I don't know if that is true or not, but we do know that these wars have been instigated by the Democratic Party regime in the United States, the party of war historically, and are likely to continue if the Democrats take power. Would they continue if Trump takes power? That is absolutely possible, and entirely so, especially as Trump, like the Democrats, does not respect international law, although the Democrats pay lip service to it, whereas he does not.
When you look at what's happened in the last year, just from perspective of morality and ethics, what for you are just some of the things that stick out in your head as some of the lowest points of the U.S. administration?
They've all been low points in the sense that this is a U.S. administration that justifies genocide, continues to support and arm and fund a genocide, and defend Israel against possible repercussions in international fora. Maybe I think the unprofessionalism of the lies and fabrications of the White House at will would repeat, copying it from Israeli propaganda. The fact that, a semi-senile Biden would, and I don't think it's his senility that is the cause of this, but that he would claim to have seen photographs of burnt and decapitated babies, a completely horrific racist atrocity fabrication by the Israelis, when no such photographs existed, when no such babies existed, is a bit of a low point as far as U.S. Or White House propaganda is concerned. Usually the American government, well practiced in telling its population and the rest of the world many lies, usually is able to cover its tracks and to manufacture these lies, in a clever way. Clearly, this time the White House did not. It didn't dot the I's, but it didn't really care. I mean, this is the idea, is that repeating Israeli propaganda in this particular instance was helpful to mobilize the world to defend the genocide. And even when some in the American press would uncover the lies and say that this did not happen, it would not have the same impact as it had when Biden announced it from the White House, with racist rhetoric about the savagery of Palestinians who allegedly killed and burned and baked and decapitated babies, atrocities, of course, that were fabricated by the Israelis, who went on to deliberately murder tens of thousands of Palestinian children since that day.
Why have the Arab countries, its neighbors, which traditionally are aligned with the USA and have been pushing for normalization with Israel recently, so it's not entirely surprising. But given the scale of what's occurred, I mean, outside of occasional condemnations, why have the Arab countries still responded the way they have?
Well, the Arab countries have responded by allying themselves with Israel and helping Israel. I mean, even today, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Mikati, has obeyed Israeli orders. The Israelis advertised a story that there are ammunitions or weapons being sent from Syria to Lebanon across the international borders in Lebanon. So Prime Minister Mikati has ordered his army, which is not defending Lebanon against Israeli aggression, to increase security at the border to prevent the passage of these, or the alleged passage of these weapons being allegedly sent from Syria. So you have a Lebanese government that is actually obeying Israeli orders today. As we know, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt have all continued to be allies of Israel, have continued to support Israel in meaningful ways during this war. We know that the UAE has been open about such support by making it possible to channel goods to Israel that may not be able to reach it by sea. The Jordanians have helped measurably in this regard by also opening their own territory to providing Israel with needed provisions while the Palestinians in Gaza are starving. Yes, it is true that the Jordanians or the UAE claim to be sending also food to the Gazans, but they have not stopped being allies of the genocidal Israeli regime and to help it actively. The Saudis continue to speak of normalization with Israel, as if Israel stops the genocide today, its regime would stop being genocidal. You know, this is like saying if you to any genocidal regime that if they stop a genocide, you will open friendly relations with them rather than demand that they be taken to an international court of law. So we have even the Jordanian foreign minister 2 days ago shamefully announcing that all 57 Muslim majority countries would happily normalize with Israel, or at least he said guarantee its security if it stopped the war. Why would 57 Muslim majority countries be interested in guaranteeing the security of a genocidal regime that has been killing and stealing the lands of Palestinians for the last 76 years is beyond me. So in fact, the Arab regimes have not been supportive of the Palestinians, a little bit rhetorically, yes. Some shipments of food, some of which were actually dropped on Gazans and killed them because they were not properly coordinated with anyone on the ground. And they continue to be the enemy of the Palestinian and the Lebanese resistance openly, not in any sort of a hidden way. So they have been, I think, also in many ways actively complicit in what Israel is doing. Some would say, well, you have to excuse them because they are proxies for the US as well, that they are beholden to US diktat. They are run by some of the many American military bases that they've allowed the US to build on their own territory. All of that may very well be true, but nonetheless, this is precisely what they have done since October 2023.
You touched on it a bit, but I just want to drive a bit deeper. What drives that behavior? Is it fear of Iran? Is it self-interest? Or is it, I mean, it's probably a combination of them, but just maybe break it down for us. Or is it just really some sort of fear of losing favor with the USA? What drives that behavior?
I think it is the latter, and not only losing favor. I mean, the US is a sponsor of these regimes that protect these unpopular dictatorial regimes by providing them with military help, with security help, with financial help, etc. So they are dependent on their continuity, on the U.S. remaining their ally. The U.S., as we know, has been the enemy of democracy everywhere in the world since World War II. Whenever there's a democratic regime, it helps sort of instigate a coup against it. It has been the friend of dictatorial regimes and governments, which it helps to support, and helps these governments repress any democratic movement or resistance movement to these dictatorships. So that's one thing. The Iranian regime has been fabricated as a major enemy of Arab countries. Indeed, it was Arab Gulf countries who have instigated a war against revolutionary Iran by facilitating the Iraqi invasion under Saddam of Iran in 1980, a war that cost hundreds of thousands of Iranian and Iraqi lives between 1980 and 1988, and bankrupted Iraq. This was a war that, at the US instigation, at the Western imperialist instigation at that time, lest the revolution in Iran sort of extend and reach the Arab Gulf regimes. So Iran was manufactured as an enemy through an aggression on it, funded and supported by Saudi Arabia, amongst other Gulf regimes, but mainly Saudi Arabia at the time, and Kuwait, of course, who funded and not fund, but rather urged Saddam Hussein to launched that war and later refused to fund his losses. It's unclear why Iran would be a threat to them or would have been a threat to them at that time, especially since they started the aggression. It is true that they began to fear Iran a lot more after 2003, when they supported the US in its war against Iraq and the destruction of Iraq at that time. That opened up the sort of Iraq to Iranian influence. And since then, in 2004, we see the Americans, and on their orders, several Arab regimes begin a major sectarian anti-Shiite movement in the Arab world, anti-Shiite propaganda that targeted not only Iran, but also Arab Shiites across the Arab world as part of some kind of an axis that is targeting something new now. A new vocabulary emerged: Sunni regimes. We'd never heard of Sunni Arab regimes before that moment. This was done from 2004, and it began with a speech that King Abdullah II of Jordan gave in 2004 when he spoke of a so-called Shiite crescent in the region. After that, we see a huge anti-Shiite propaganda, sectarian propaganda that the Arab regimes and the Americans flooded the Arab airwaves with, and continue to do so. It became more of an issue after Hezbollah's victory over Israel in 2006. And since then, it has not abated. I think the Iranian threat continues to exist insofar as Iran has continued to be a target of the aggression of the US, Israel, and the Arab allies of Israel as well in the region. So yes, that is there. But I think being fully beholden to the US, and these Arab regimes also, like Israel, their military and sort of foreign policies are fully governed by US diktat. They may have the wherewithal to run their own countries in ways that they see fit, but even that, I mean, their economies are beholden also to the US and to its imperialist arms like the IMF and the World Bank. And therefore, in many ways, they don't make these decisions on their own. So they are beholden to the US. And if there is indeed an objective Iranian threat in the region, it is one that has been made possible by these policies of the US, Israel, and the Arab client regimes of the US.
You haven't mentioned Egypt much, or if you have, you haven't spoken a lot about it. Is it just because Egypt's become quite insignificant? I mean, it used to be a regional power. It would have been 20 years ago, if we were speaking about this, it would have been something you mentioned quite a lot. What's happened with Egypt?
No, I've mentioned that Egypt also has been has continued to be a friend of Israel, even if it also speaks against Israeli policies publicly, and it has continued to meet with its regional allies, especially with Jordan and the Emiratis, to coordinate different steps. The Egyptians also, perhaps they have slightly more wherewithal in terms of U.S. influence over them, but not when it comes to policy toward Israel. As we can see, all countries that had normalized relations with Israel continue their normalization, continue their diplomatic relations. None of them has cut off diplomatic relations with Israel, even though many of them, for example, some 10 years ago had cut off relations with Syria, let's say. So it is very interesting that they are capable of cutting off relations with countries that offend their sense of humanity, but not others. So, and I think this has to do, of course, with the influence that the US has over.
So we've basically spoken now about the Arab governments. Obviously, the Arab street is seeing what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon and the West Bank and Syria and many other places. What will be the potential street blowback, both in terms of the region, in terms of the stability of these regimes? What do you see unfolding?
Listen, I mean, since the 1980s, and especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, the US has had a major propaganda campaign and huge funding that went into so-called research centers, publications, and what have you, and of course, most importantly, the media, to transform Arab public opinion, first of all, to make Iran the threat to Arabs, hence the importance of sectarianism, because just Iran on its own did not work to convince the majority of Arabs that Iran is their major enemy and not Israel. So sectarianism was brought in to help in this regard. But in addition to this, of course, you have the IMF and the World Bank, who have assiduously dismantled the welfare state across these countries. But what is interesting is that while they don't like state support or subsidies to any social programs like education and health for the population, the IMF and the World Bank, unsurprisingly, have not touched the much larger budgets and the huge funding that the state spends on its internal security and on its armies, because these are required to put down any resistance, any democratic movements for change. And therefore, the IMF and the World Bank don't touch those budgets at all. They might touch the bureaucracy of the state as well as its social programs. So as a result, you have a huge amount of increased repression across the Arab countries, especially after 2011, but even before that, to make sure that no sort of defiance of the US and its program for the Arab world in terms of making Iran the enemy and not Israel, in terms of propagating a kind of a liberal European and American racist values in the Arab world, wherein Israeli violence is a self-defense, but resistance is a form of terrorism and things of that sort, and in creating a class of Arab intellectuals that are completely sort of in the service of this US agenda. USAID, US embassies in the region host these people, have a lot of programs for them, research programs, centers, NGOs, US and European embassies and so-called research centers have opened branches in the Arab world or fund local NGOs and the local press precisely to drive these points home. And despite that, they've been unable to fully alter the opinion of the majority of Arabs, as their own polls tell us. So polls that are conducted by many centers, supported and funded by the US and Western Europe, seem to still tell us that the majority of polled Arabs across the Arab world continue to see Israel as their main enemy and not Iran. However, we have not seen, and you are right to allude to this, we have not seen major demonstrations overtaking Arab capitals, as, for example, we had seen them during the United States invasion of Iraq, let's say. And I think this is a successful result of the campaign of repression funded and trained by the US and European powers since the 1990s, but especially after 2011. This has, of course, been very effective in the Palestinian occupied territories in the West Bank, where you have a collaborator Palestinian Authority whose repressive police force is trained by the US and by the European Union to attack and repress any Palestinians who deign to resist the apartheid system that the Israeli occupation imposed on them. 3 days ago, so-called unelected President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority was very much upset at a meeting of the Palestinian Authority or the Fatah movement, in which someone suggested that his security goons should stop arresting and following and chasing Palestinians who are resisting the Israeli occupation, but who are not necessarily part of Hamas or any organized group. He was exceedingly upset, according to reports in the press, because he said, if we don't, then that would give the Israelis even more reason to come in and pursue them themselves, as if the Israelis are not doing a good job already of this. So his concern is that he and his authority remain the primary police force to repress any resistance to Israel, and objects to any kind of resistance otherwise. So as a result, so you have all the major Arab regimes collaborating with Israel, if not collaborating, at least sort of being certainly not helping the Palestinians in any direct way in this. And you have a huge sort of cover-up of what is happening by the European allies of Israel and these Arab countries, and by the United States, which when you listen to their propaganda, you would think it is Israel and Israeli Jews that are being subjected to genocide, rather than Israel that is committing a genocide against sort of a captive population in a concentration camp like Gaza, not to mention the hundreds of Lebanese civilians and Palestinian civilians it has killed in southern Lebanon over the last 2 weeks.
You've spoken about this, very elaborately, and painted actually a very insightful picture of how this plays out in terms of imperialism. Through the prism of imperialism, if there is a regional war, even with the kind of regional conflict we have now, what do you see the roles of Russia and China being in terms of bolstering Iran or supporting it, or sort of kind of putting up a front to kind of stop this Western US-backed imperialism?
I'm not sure they will have a direct role. Clearly, Russian military help to Syria has not in any way prevented the ongoing Israeli almost daily aggression and raids on Syria over the last decade, including the bombing of Syria's civilian airports, without any retaliation from the Syrians. The most the Syrians have done is try to down Israeli planes unsuccessfully, or shoot down Israeli missiles also unsuccessfully for the most part. So the Russian military help that has been given to Syria has never sort of reached a level where the Russians would intervene directly to stop Israeli aggression on Syria. And remember, the Russians also are not necessarily enemies of Israel and have relatively good relations with it. And the Chinese also have opened relations with Israel since 1992 and have relatively good relations, even if they may disagree or condemn ongoing policies, especially in the United Nations or in international fora. The Chinese have been even more averse to any kind of military conflict. They don't believe they should be involved in such a conflict. So I think, however, if a major attack, US-led attack on Iran takes place, I think they would take notice of what that means, because that would be really sending strong signals to them by the US as to them, being sort of next in line if they misbehave in a way that the US disapproves of, or if they behave rather in a way that the US disapproves of. So it's unclear to me sort of if they would intervene militarily in any such war. Yeah, I actually doubt that they would.
You've spoken a lot about a history of a lot of atrocities and suppression in the region, and American-led suppression, so to speak. But even despite that, the scale of what we've seen in the last year, how does that impact international law, legitimacy, institutions, global institutions? Or is it just a case of these were already institutions that were kind of holding up the status quo anyway? But I mean, surely it must have had an impact. And you've seen the other day in the UN, Israel lost the vote substantially, more significantly than it ever has in terms of states recognizing that Palestine is occupied. What does this mean for institutions and international law?
Well, I mean, these institutions have lost a lot of their power ever since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. You have to remember that the League of Nations was invented after World War I to kind of check the rivalry between the imperialist and colonialist white supremacist European states and the white supremacist United States at that time, in order to kind of regulate the colonial system in a certain way and deal with the defeated empires. The United Nations, on the other hand, was created after World War II to kind of manage the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union as the two emergent powers, for the US to also check the remnant colonial governments' powers in the international sphere, and to deal with the question of decolonization. Now, the United Nations, of course, by the 1960s began to be used by decolonized states as an important forum for it. It began to issue all kinds of new regulations about decolonization and about principles of self-determination and what have you, which the US had always, of course, opposed. The US opposed, for example, that self-determination become a right back at the beginning of the founding of the United Nations, and even though the Soviets and the Arab countries at the time fully supported that. We see this also in the 1960s. By 1970, the US already was able to reverse a lot of the progress that the decolonized states had made with the support of the Soviet Union and the socialist camp at that time. And in the 1970s began to reverse that. I mean, the US had sponsored a large number of coups, beginning perhaps in Syria in 1949, overthrowing a democratic government and replacing it with a military dictator at the time, Hosni Zaim. Following that, it was the overthrow of Massad in Iran in 1953, of Arbenz in Guatemala in 54, of the Jordanian Prime Minister Nabulsi in 1957, and on in 64, the overthrow of Goulart, in 65 of Sukarno in Indonesia, and the murder of 1 million people under the pretext that they were communists, in 66 of Nkrumah in Ghana, the murder of Lumumba in the Congo, the overthrow of Allende in 73 in Chile. The US was, basically increasingly continuing to aggress against these sovereign states, in addition to its war in Indochina. By the 70s, it began to increasingly have more and more power at the United Nations, and chip away at the advancement that decolonized states had made. And by the time the Soviet Union collapses at the end of the 1980s, the United Nations became really nothing but a platform for the US to impose its will on the rest of the world. Today, the Democratic Party feels that, in the US, the Democratic Party regime has always felt that it needs this cover, as a kind of something aesthetically pleasing, but also legitimizing at a surface level of what US policy does around the world. Trump perhaps is less committed to this. He understands that while the United Nations has and continues to legitimize US power and US wars, sometimes it has to allow voices that are critical of US policy. And there's no need for this, because there's no power that can stop the US today in the globe. So he feels that it is money badly spent on the UN, and it kind of is annoying. And since he has no respect for international law, someone like him would likely stop funding for the United Nations. But this does not mean that the Democratic Party regime in the US has any more respect for international law. It does not. It might feign some respect, but as we see, it refused, for example, and made light of the decision taken by the International Court of Justice, and it has been threatening the International Criminal Court with all kinds of explicit and implicit threats if it issues any kind of warrants for Israeli war criminals. In that sense, I think the UN is being used as a forum by many in the third world in the hope that it can check US power and the power of its proxies around the world. I'm not sure any of the achievements of the last year have more than symbolic value in the absence of any consensus that international law should govern our globe, and in the absence of any respect for international law by the United States. So as a result, it's I think certainly the United Nations, international bodies that govern our globe have been weakened increasingly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but perhaps we've seen the fruits or the fruit of all that more clearly in the last year.
There's a lot of analysis. I mean, I spoke to Ilan Pape a few months ago, and he said, given Israel's overreach, it looks like Zionism is coming to an end. Israel's behavior is extremely short-sighted, and it will probably it will definitely have bad long-term ramifications on Israel's future. What do you make of this analysis? Do you agree with it? Do you think it's some aspects you agree with, but there's other aspects that are problematic? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think as long as Israel is able to perform its role as a proxy for US imperialism, the US will do whatever it takes to preserve it, right? Even if Israel has to kill millions of people in the Middle East, the US will continue to support it if that means it can preserve its role as a US proxy. If it cannot, then the US will have to withdraw its support for it. Now, we've seen the Israeli economy has been significantly weakened in the last year and will continue to sort of nosedive. We've seen hundreds of thousands of Israeli Jews leave Israel, and without plans to come back. We have seen the weakness of the Israeli military in ways that it had never been seen before. I mean, the brief weakness that we witnessed in 1973 when it was surprised by the Syrian and the Egyptian armies attempt to recapture their own occupied territories in the Sinai and the Golan Heights. At the time, of course, the US very quickly sent its ships and its arms to be able to regain Israeli military superiority. But in the last year, I mean, the Israeli military defeats have been just accumulating one after the other. In the last 2 weeks alone, I mean, it's been just shocking at how weak and inept and unable Israel is to invade countries at will and with impunity as it had done before, or be able to defend itself against retaliation by Iran against Israel in response, in response to ongoing Israeli anti-Iranian aggression. So all these things are in many ways important to assess in terms of the survivability of the Israeli genocidal regime. But also, in addition, of course, you have a major schism within Israel itself between the colonists of how this genocidal regime should run the country, what kind of rights Israeli Jews should have in the country, what right does what sort of juridical arrangement should the government and the regime have. All of this, of course, has been a major dividing issue in Israel for the last decade or so. And we know even before the genocidal regime launched its genocide, it already was facing a huge amount of demonstrations and divisiveness within Israel itself. Also, it is interesting to see the contrast between Zionism in the time of genocide, as one could say. So, and the Zionists failed to get the majority support of Jewish populations and communities around the world in the first half century of their existence. The majority of Jews came to support Zionism, and not very strongly, after the Holocaust and after World War II. Because they felt that with the abandonment of European countries, including the US, not allowing Jewish refugees and survivors of the Holocaust to come in, that perhaps there was no other place that Jews could take refuge, and many Jewish communities whose majority had been anti-Zionist, began to cozy up and warm up to the Zionist project after the Holocaust, as they saw it as a possible refuge for surviving Jews. And the only way these Jewish communities began to increasingly support Israel is through Israel always claiming that, in fact, it could become a victim of another Holocaust and that it is the only possible defense of another genocide of Jews worldwide. So the weaponization of genocide, both as a possible fate for Israel, which required that a Jewish community supported around the world, or the possibility that it is the only possible defense of Jews against the possible genocide, which required that Jews around the world support it, began to be the propaganda lines in the 50s and especially in the 1960s and 70s. Since 1982, the use of genocide to legitimize Israel in the eyes of both European and American Christians and Jews began to backfire. This is after its massacres in Lebanon and its killing of about 20,000 Palestinians and Lebanese civilians at that time. This led then to accusations that Israel was actually committing genocide by the Soviet Union and by several European and Latin American countries at that time. Then we begin to hear more sort of accusations of genocide against Israel in the coming decades. So by then you begin to see actually a major shift in Western opinion, especially in Jewish opinion, in terms of their support for Israel. After the genocidal war was launched a year ago, we've seen a huge amount of not only Western Christians, but especially American and European Jews, not only not support Israel, but oppose it, recognizing that it is committing a genocide and opposing its genocidal policies. These Jews have been in the forefront of the campaign against the ongoing support for Israel in the West, the campaign to defend Palestinians against this genocide. So while Zionism had legitimized itself through weaponizing the anti-Semitic Hitlerian genocide against the Jewish people in Europe, and used that in the next several decades to mobilize more support, that it's defending itself against the possible genocide, or that it is the only force that could protect Jews from it, today that has backfired because the majority of people that supported it for that reason now oppose it, realizing that what it is committing is a genocide against Palestinians. So it's an important transformation, it seems to me, in the legitimacy of Israel and Zionism amongst Jewish communities in the West. And they are sort of the Jews that Israel had always hoped to recruit to its project, to transform them into Zionists. So so they were pro-Zionists, but not Zionists because they refused to move to Israel in their majority, and now they are anti-Zionist. And polls that have been reported in the European press and in the American press have shown a huge decline in support for Israel and a huge sort of anti-Israeli attitude, especially by the younger generations of American or European Jews, especially since the beginning of the genocide, but even before. So all of these do show that Israel is weakened, that the future of Israel is not guaranteed. That's something not only being said by Ilan Pappé, it is being said by Israeli leaders and prime ministers who in the last 10 years have been saying, we're not sure we're going to reach the age of 80, or that Israel will reach 100, that we could be destroyed before then. Of course, they say this time and again to weaponize the idea of a genocide, that we might become victims of genocide rather than we are the ones committing the genocide. But does this mean that Israel will disappear? I think it could very well mean that. It's not going to happen overnight. Regimes don't fall that quickly. I mean, at the end, in the last days, they do fall quickly, but a lot has to happen before then. And I think the ongoing resistance to Israeli settler colonialism, to Israeli aggression and ongoing genocide is, of course, a huge factor in this situation. So yes, is Israel in a much, much weaker position and the chances of its survival and the survival of its genocidal regime and apartheid regime is more at stake than it had been before October 7th? Absolutely. Is it going to fall tomorrow? Well, its regime is going to fall tomorrow. I don't think tomorrow, but yes, it has been severely weakened.
Professor Joseph, we're just going to get slightly personal for the next while. What motivated you to become a scholar of the Middle East and take the stances that you've taken?
Well, I think when I came to study in the United States, I came to study engineering. I was not politicized or political in any way. I was politicized in the US. I mean, I think mostly facing white American racism and anti-Palestinianism was a bit of a cultural shock when I arrived in the early 80s to go to college. I had gone to European schools in Jordan, was very positively predisposed to sort of Western cultural products and what have you. Of course, I was very pro-Palestinian. I understood the West as being pro-Israel, and I saw that as a failing, but not a reason for me to in any way be negatively predisposed. So it was actually living in the US that has increasingly made me strongly displeased with the kind of racism that I encountered on a personal level, but that I had seen expressed against Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, of course, not to mention the major victims of American racism, namely African Americans and Latino Americans. And I understood very, very quickly within a couple of years what this was about, and I began to be politicized and began to read up a great amount of histories of the world, including of the Middle East. I think taking the positions that I've taken came naturally to me because as someone who knows this history very well, but also as someone who's been quite disappointed in the American Academy, especially the leftist members of the Academy, and especially a large number of Arab members of that Academy, whether Arab Americans or Arab immigrants, a large number of whom have often taken what I consider to be liberal and European and American racist positions on the right of the oppressed to resistance. Of course, there have been, major people who have not taken those positions and who have supported the right of the colonized across the world to resist. But I felt that it is important to give voice to a scholarly voice to that right and to provide a critique of these positions that are often bandied about as somehow not anti-Palestinian, but really, in my opinion, ultimately are.
Just for the benefit of our audience, when you went to America, you were coming from Jordan, that you've lived in your whole life, and you're Jordanian Palestinian or Jordanian?
I'm Jordanian Palestinian. Both my parents were expelled in 1948 from Jaffa. They come from different families. My parents met in 1957. My mother's family were expelled to Lebanon. My father's family ended up in the West Bank and then in Jordan by 1952. So when my parents married, my mother moved from Lebanon in 1958 to Jordan. So yes, I was born and raised in Jordan.
From the start of when you started studying politics formally, not we all kind of study politics through observation from the time we were little kids, but from the time you started studying it in the US formally, what do you think is the one thing that you've kind of learnt that for you has been the most essential thing in terms of opening up your eyes and driving your analysis?
When I began to read, like I said, I arrived here. I didn't know much of what was going on. Faced with racism at a time, I arrived in 1982. So I witnessed the anti-Palestinian sentiments during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. I witnessed the massacres of Sabra and Shatila on television, and I was shocked because these are things I had read about. I didn't realize that I would live to witness such things, even on television screens. This impelled me to begin to read books initially about the Arab world and the Middle East, but then I began to read up on post-World War II world in Latin America and Southern Africa and East Asia. And not having any theoretical background, not being politicized in any way before, not ever joining a political party or belonging to one, I was quite surprised to learn that in every possible tragedy that befell a third world country since World War II, the US had a principal role in bringing that kind of oppression about. So reading about Chile, reading about Nicaragua, reading about Angola, reading about South Africa, reading about Vietnam, reading about Palestine, reading about Indonesia, it was quite shocking to me. I had not realized that the US had played such a negative role in suppressing democracy around the third world since World War II. So as a young, naive, late teenager or in my early 20s, this was the major revelation, actually, to me, not having had that kind of a political or historical education before arriving in the US.
To a large extent, a lot of that was Cold War, USA and Henry Kissinger kind of doctrine driven. Was there a moment maybe in the early 2000s where you thought the US would pivot from this all-out imperialist, country to kind of becoming more of a global player? Do you think there was a moment like that, or it was just rhetoric all the time?
Never. There was never such a moment. I understood perfectly well that the US would run amok after the fall of the Soviet Union and do whatever it wanted in the world that it could not do because of the Soviet rivalry and the Soviet threat. Now that this was defeated and was no longer a threat, it could do whatever it wanted, and it has. I was not disappointed in my expectation.
Given all that you've seen and read and understood about atrocities and global power, to what extent does what you've seen in the last year still shock you? Not in terms of the violence that's actually unfolded, but also in terms of the rhetoric around it and how it's been covered. And what do you think this all kind of means?
Listen, I mean, the US alone has been responsible for the murder of around 25 million people since World War II around the world, through its wars of proxy wars, etc. So, and all of these atrocities have been covered up by the Western media, very, very well. Yes, there is a difference that now this genocide is being live streamed, given it's taking place at a time when the social media is everywhere. So perhaps it is different from wars that killed hundreds of thousands in Central and Southern Africa in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, or that killed millions in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, or in Indonesia in 65. And so if in those times there was sort of an anti-US media, perhaps spearheaded by the opposite camp, the Soviets, and the socialist camp, and some third world anti-imperialists, to speak about the atrocities that the US had committed. They didn't have the reach to in the West to reach sort of Western audiences and the Western populations. Today, it seems to me the live streaming of the genocide on social media has reached these populations in ways that nothing, Soviet propaganda could not, or counter American propaganda could not during the Cold War. And this is, of course, why we see the US being very assiduous and diligent in suppressing social media, whether the censorship on Facebook and on X, formerly Twitter, on TikTok, etc. They're ongoing, in addition, of course, to the formal censorship in the major US propaganda arms and major newspapers whose editors have instructed their writers not to use certain words like Palestine or refugees or refugee camps, about which I've written before to Middle East Eye. For me, it is that is interesting. That is an interesting sort of transformation, that people could ostensibly have access to information that counters the propaganda that is being put out by the US propaganda industry or its European allies' propaganda industry. But in terms of the attitude, I mean, listen, the New York Times has never supported the rights of the Maoris in New Zealand or the Aborigines in Australia, let alone those of Native Americans in the US or the First Nations in Canada. Why should I expect it to support the Palestinians? On the contrary, I think the Western press has always supported the right of white supremacist colonists against the non-white colonized. The Palestine situation is just the latest example, or an ongoing example of that, alongside the continued attack on the colonized everywhere. I've never seen an article in the Western mainstream press that defends the rights of the Kanaka Maoli in the indigenous population of Hawaii against the ongoing white American colonization of the island. So again, I don't see anything out of the ordinary in this coverage. So it's a normal propaganda effort.
Given, what you said earlier on about decentralized information, social media, demographic changes everywhere, for how long do you think they could keep this up? For how long do you think the New York Times can still give instructions to its reporters not to use refugee and Palestinian, and given that there's so much more information out there now?
As long as it takes.
Professor Joseph Massad, just a few final thoughts. It's now been a year since October 7th. Where do you think we'll likely be a year from now?
It's very difficult to predict. I mean, I think the Israelis have been aggressors in the Arab region and the Middle East region ever since they were established their settler colony and their genocidal and apartheid regime since 1948. Of course, the hope is that this regime would be overthrown, that this genocidal apartheid government would be overthrown and replaced by a new arrangement that gives equality to everyone. Is that likely to happen in the next year? I don't believe so. Will the US continue to support Israel in its genocide and its aggression around the Middle East? Yes. Will this become a regional war? Remains unclear. Will Palestinian resistance against Israeli violence and settler colonialism continue a year from now? Absolutely. Will ongoing Israeli violence against the Palestinian people and the suppression of their will to equality and to live freely on their land without apartheid and genocidal policies continue? Absolutely. Will Jewish settlers' pogroms against Palestinians continue? I believe that they would, or that they will continue. So unless something major changes in the world, unless the Israeli government falls, unless it is replaced by a government perhaps not equally committed to genocide, depends on what. I mean, I'm not holding much hope for a change in the administration in the US, whether the Democratic Party stays in power or is replaced by the Republicans, I think will have no consequence for the Middle East. Both parties compete in their support for American imperial policies in the region. They both compete in their support for Israel's right to commit genocide in the name of defending itself. So I don't think it'll make a difference to the Middle East region. Again, I am more sure that a continuation of the Democratic Party regime in power would mean that more wars will continue. There's no guarantee that Trump, who is quite, holds imperialist and racist views of the region as he does of all racial minorities in the US. It is unclear what his strategy would be to stop these wars or to continue them. But we know for sure that the genocidal Biden administration and the Harris administration would have no qualms about continuing.
Professor, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.